Good evening. I'm Kimberly Johnson, the Chief Executive Officer of the Tulsa City County Library. I'm so pleased that you can join us virtually for this special program opening of TCCL Remembers. Over the next 2 months, we will commemorate the Centennial of Tulsa's 1921 Race Massacre through a series of programs that promote empathy, reconciliation, and healing. The dark days in Tulsa's past, nearly 100 years ago, has been a focus of the library's work. Nearly 23 years ago, TCCL opened the African American Resource Center to highlight the history and culture of the African American experience. The Resource Center is located at Rudisill Library. We have made it a priority to bring awareness and understanding of race relations throughout our communities, and we have been intentional about offering opportunities to support the community's education and understanding. Over the past year, our staff have worked diligently developing programming to honor all who have been impacted by the Tulsa Race Massacre and explore its lingering impact. We will lift up works of fiction and nonfiction to spark meaningful conversations about challenges past and present, including racial and cultural divisions. The conversation starts tonight and continues with Mira Jacob, author of Good Talk, on March 18th. Robin DiAngelo, author of White Fragility, April 22nd. And on May 6th, Jason Reynolds, the New York Times bestselling author and winner of the 2021 Ann V. Zarrow Award for Young Readers Literature, will join us. And Clifton Talbert, author of 14 books, including 8 Habits of the Heart, will close out the program series on May 11th. I invite you to visit one of our 24 library locations for a TCCL Remembers brochure, or visit our website at tulsalibrary.org for the complete list of programs and time offerings. Tonight's program and the series of programs to follow wouldn't be possible without the support of our dedicated partners. I'd like to thank the Tulsa City County Library Commission, the Tulsa Library Trust, the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission, WPX Energy, the African American Resource Center, the Friends of the Tulsa City County Library, and Fulton Street Books and Coffee. This evening, we are pleased to have Hannibal Johnson with us to begin this important conversation. Mr. Johnson is a Harvard Law School graduate and an expert on the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre. He is the author of 10 books, including his latest, Black Wall Street 100, An American City Grapples with its Historical Racial Trauma. Joining Hannibal to facilitate the discussion is Tulsa native and TCCL Regional Manager, Keith Jemison. Welcome, gentlemen.
Hi, thank you, Kim. Thank you for that introduction. For all of our listeners, we're glad to have you tonight. I do want to point out that we have Q&A function on your Zoom, so you can put your questions in at any time. I'd like to start the interview with Mr. Hannibal Johnson by taking a visual journey to look at that very, very dark period of the Tulsa Race Massacre. So I'm going to show some slides from what we have at the Tulsa City County Library's collection and also in the Borough Fort collection, and ask Mr. Johnson to make some comments about these various scenes. I wanted to do this because we have people from all over the country who may be joining us, and we know that this will be recorded and we'll have it for posterity, and there'll also be a way of having a record of those images and his comments. Yes, and we'll start with our slides that are coming. This is the one of the book, and then we have the and there he is, his smiling face. And so we'll go and look at these images. All of these photos, again, I say, come from the Tulsa City County Library's African American Resource Center and the Borough Fort collection. You can find this information by going to tulsalibrary.org/research or our digital collections.tulsalibrary.org. So, Mr. Johnson, I'll just put them up and listen for any comments that you may have. I just wanted to show some of this devastation that was caused.
Yeah, the panoramic shots are particularly compelling. Those broad shots that show the devastation that was wrought in 1921. Utter desolation, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's amazing the magnitude of the destruction. Same here.
Mm-hmm.
Just utter destruction. People being marched to the various internment centers throughout Tulsa, the Black citizens being held by the National Guard during this period.
This looks like residents of African Americans displaced. Yeah. Some more devastation.
Displacement and destruction are two common themes, right?
Right.
Running the Negro out of Tulsa. So postcards were made of these post-massacre scenes, as was common during the day to make postcards after racial violence, including lynchings, right?
Yeah. It's just so odd.
These are Black men being marched through town out of the Greenwood community.
And they were not criminals yet. They were asked to hold their hands up and,
right,
as if they were.
Absolutely.
My gosh.
What appears to be a dead body.
Oh
Captioned Tulsa Race Riot, June 1st, 1921, Convention Hall.
This example, I think the caption on there is, which we can't see, it talks about the homeless.
Right.
Negroes.
Just shows the destitution after the devastation.
My gosh. Just look at that. What is this? This is the Mount Zion?
It's Mount Zion on fire, looks like.
That's after the fire of the Mount Zion Baptist Church. That's our final slide.
That's B.C. Franklin, who's a prominent lawyer, helped a lot of the victims with their legal claims. His office was actually destroyed in the massacre, so he operated with his personnel. He was his secretary and assistant. They're operating out of a tent temporarily because life goes on, business goes on, people still have legal claims and legal needs. He served those needs.
Great. Thank you. So those are just some of the slides that we have from some of the images that you can find in the Tulsa City County Library's digital collection. I found the book very valuable. I think the book is an important work for all of us to read, to find out about not only Tulsa's dark past, but what has the city of Tulsa done? What have they been grappling with as a result of something that happened in 1921? I think the book is very well documented and it was very revealing. I found things I'd not heard before, having been around the topic for a long time. And I think it's a good community must-read book. Take the time to be engaged with a lot of questions, and you'll see the format of his book. We'll talk a little bit more about that. I hope you elaborate a little bit more about that because it has some activities that you can do. It has some questions that you can ask, and I think it's just so ideal for families to use as well as for clubs, organizations, you know. So the title, Black Wall Street 100, obviously the Centennial recognition, it's 100 years later. But I'd like for you to elaborate a little bit on that subtitle about an American city grapples with its historical racial trauma. What is the historical trauma in Tulsa and for whom?
So Black Wall Street 100, as you correctly point out, is a reference to the Centennial commemoration. What's going to be on the minds and hearts of people who visit us and even people who are already here as we approach the 100th anniversary of the massacre is what's different about Tulsa today? What's different in that expanse between 1921 and 2021? We have been grappling with a historical racial trauma, hence the subtitle. We are not the only community in America that has historical racial trauma. In fact, many, if not most communities in America have similar traumatic events in their past around race. So we can be a model or an example for how a community comes to grips with its past by first acknowledging and then apologizing, which apology for me is not just the literal act of apology, but it's also developing a sense of compassion and empathy for what other people have been through. And then the third prong of that process is atonement. How do we make amends for the damage that was done? How do we repair the damage that's been done? So the title is really deliberate. The message is really deliberate and direct around historical racial trauma. It's not historical diversity trauma.
There you go.
It's historical racial trauma. It's very particularistic around the African-American experience.
Yeah, appreciate you explaining that too. You include in your book a letter that had a very vivid description from Jessie Hannibal, I think I pronounced it right, in Tulsa, that she wrote to her sister in Tucson, Arizona. And it was dated June 2nd, the day right after, allegedly, the massacre. The part that stuck out to me was on page 61, but I'm going to read a little bit of it and get your comments about it. She says, down by the Frisco Depot, a dead Negro lay with his stomach cut open and his intestines laying on the ground and across his legs. He laid there several hours, the flies swarming thick over him. Jessie Hannibal goes on to say, talk of war, this was sure war and a bloody one. It just stuck with me. I didn't want to forget it. And I just wanted to know why you included that letter and how did you feel about that?
The author of the letter, Jessie Hannibal, presents a very vivid description of the events of the massacre. Jessie Hannibal was a white woman. She lived close to the Greenwood community. She was writing to her sister who lived in Tucson. And she describes the events from a white woman's perspective. So while she appears to be sympathetic in a lot of the letter, she also later uses the term nigger to describe Dick Rowland, right? She's a product of her time. She's a reader of the Tulsa Tribune, which published a series of inflammatory, incendiary articles and editorials. So it's a really, I think, compelling vantage on what happened during the massacre. Jessie Hannibal has long since died. She left the letter to her daughter. She actually mailed the letter to her sister. The sister read the letter and sent it back, which apparently was a thing back in the day. She thought the letter might have historical value. She might want to hold on to it.
Right.
She held on to it for a long time. She passed it down to her daughter after she died. The daughter, this has been several years ago, 5 to 7 years ago, the daughter was an elderly woman living in an assisted living facility. Her caregiver, she sent her caregiver with the letter over to the Greenwood Cultural Center because to see if the Greenwood Cultural Center might see some value in the letter. And obviously they did.
Gosh, yes.
And that's how I got hold of the letter. And it's quite unique, colorful, and really gives you a vivid description, not only of the event, but also of the various mindsets and perspectives that were operating in the community at the time.
Yeah, so it real definitely had historical value. And you mentioned earlier when we were looking at some of those slides about how they would send postcards too of images of lynching and that kind of thing. And it's just amazing to me that this kind of letter would survive and that they would come after all these years to bring it to us and share it with us so we can see what it was really like and what they were writing. I'm going to go a little different. On page 120, the Riot Commission estimates that the property cost in the Greenwood District was approximately $2 million in 1921 or $16,752,000 in 1999. Yet there was no conviction for any of the violent acts against African Americans or any insurance payment to African Americans for their homes, personal property, as well as a result of the riot. So how have we burdened our future with our unresolved past?
Well, I had this conversation earlier today with somebody about, we talk about the wealth gap all the time. So Black wealth is generally 1/10 of white wealth. Part of the reason it is generally 1/10 of white wealth is because there have been things in our past which have prevented the intergenerational transfer of wealth. And if we look specifically at just what happened in Tulsa, we had a relatively wealthy Black community.
Yeah.
The Black community was perceived in the sort of mindset of white supremacy as being too uppity and needed to learn a lesson about their relative place in society. That's part of the impetus for destroying the community.
Mm-hmm.
It was perceived as an economic threat, a political threat, a social threat, and so forth. Part of the result of the destruction is that, as you correctly pointed out, no one was really ever compensated for their losses. So those losses couldn't be transferred intergenerationally. So the kids of those victims end up behind in terms of their white counterparts.
Right.
So we've had all sorts of incidents in our history where our ability to transfer wealth, what meager wealth we may have had, was impeded in some way
Yes.
by the dominant culture.
Right.
So that's one thing that's really important about the devastation of an economic entrepreneurial community like Black Wall Street.
Could you talk a little bit more about the entrepreneurial environment as it was on Greenwood? I think a lot of our readers, we hear about Black Wall Street, they think like, oh, it was a Black Wall Street, thinking that it's like New York Wall Street, but it's certainly successful African Americans. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
So Black Wall Street is just a really loose description of the community. I tell people that a better description would be Black Main Street, because these weren't banks and investment banking firms and businesses like that. These were mom and pop type operations. And we're talking about restaurants, grocery stores, movie theaters, dance halls, pool halls, barbershops, beauty salons, confectionaries, haberdashery, shoe shine shops, shoe repair shops, pharmacies. And we're talking about a concentration of service providers, doctors, lawyers, dentists, accountants. So we're talking really about what you might find in Main Street America in many places.
Right.
The difference is, though, this was a segregated Black community in the broader context of the city of Tulsa. And that concentration, that rich concentration of these business people and entrepreneurs was relatively unique in the United States.
Yes. How did they come about being called? I think it was called the Negro Wall Street, and then later we said Black Wall Street.
Booker T. Washington is actually credited with giving the community that label. Makes sense. Booker T. Washington promoted this idea of Black industriousness. Mm-hmm. The concept then was, if we as Black people can show that we can be industrious, we can run our own businesses, we can be self-governing. Right. If we can do that and white people see us doing that, then racism will just sort of go away on its own. That's a sort of attractive notion, but it's tried and tested and failed. It doesn't quite work that way.
Right. I like that explanation you gave to me about that. But the question I hear a lot of times in the community, and I wondered about it, pondered it when I was reading the book, is should the city make restitution by paying the survivors or the estates of those who died or their families for their losses? Because it seems like tourism is going to take off. There's a lot of interest in Greenwood. There's a lot of money generated down there on Greenwood. So from any of your research, I hear this a lot, the sentiment. I just wanted to get your take on whether that's even possible legally as an attorney.
So I always want to have a much broader conversation when we're talking about reparations. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, a lot of people, I think, unnecessarily truncate or limit the parameters of the conversation. The conversation about reparations ought to be, what is it we need to do to make amends? What is it we need to do to repair the damage? There are several options in terms of things that we could do. They're not mutually exclusive. So if I were prioritizing, the first thing we need to do, we're doing it, which is curriculum reform. We need to make sure that we treat this history with the prominence and the dignity that it deserves, if for no other reasons, so that we don't repeat it. So we need to make sure that we infuse the history into a regular curriculum throughout the state. So we're working on that. Another thing that we could do is collective or communal reparations. In other words, what things can we do to create community assets that address the harms of the past, but also help us move together forward into the future. So I'm working on Greenwood Rising, for example, which is the history center that we're building on the corner of Greenwood and Archer.
Yes.
I consider Greenwood Rising a form of reparation. The whole point of Greenwood Rising is to tell the narrative of the Greenwood community to the world in a way that people who visit Greenwood Rising are able to think about what they've learned in that context and apply those lessons to current challenges that we face, and see the through line between, for example, the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre and Black Lives Matter, and mass incarceration, and educational deficits, and healthcare disparities, and all the challenges that we face today around race. And we know that we face these racial challenges because our own city, led by Mayor Bynum, is working on what's called the equality indicators. So we know that race is a determinant on virtually every aspect of social well-being in this community. And how do we close those gaps? One of the ways that we close those gaps is to close the knowledge gap, to make sure we understand where we've been and better appreciate and understand where it is that we're going.
Because in your book, you talk about how Tulsa Public Schools didn't teach about the race riot. I think Mayor Susan Savage has a comment in the book too. So she had never heard about the race riot. And I myself had never heard of this in high school. I just discovered it. So it leads me to believe, I want to ask your take on it. I've always heard, why was it such a dark secret? Why were they just muffled by what had happened? I mean, across the board, blacks and whites, none of them ever talked much about it.
I think if you really think about it, it becomes fairly clear that there are a whole bunch of psychological dynamics going on at the time of the massacre in 1921. So, for example, Tulsa was on its way to becoming the self-described oil capital of the world. Tulsa saw herself as a cosmopolitan city, a city to be emulated by other cities throughout the United States. So it would be highly inconvenient to talk about, let alone infuse into the curriculum, this horrible, horrible incident in 1921.
They were ashamed.
There was shame as well in sectors of the community, people who felt, you know, I may not have done what I could have done to help prevent this. People in the white community. In the black community, there no doubt was something that we would call today PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a disabling condition. There was also fear. If this happened once, it could perhaps happen again. It did happen again in other places. The Rosewood riot in Florida happened in 1923, a couple of years after this. So the other thing in the black community that I heard something about from some of the survivors was there was a feeling among people right after the incident that they didn't want to burden their children with this horror because it might stunt their growth and development in some way. That was a real feeling as well. So we have this complex web of psychological dynamics that are operating to keep folk, black and white, from really talking about this. And really, I think the pivot point in terms of opening up the discussions around this history was the convening of what was called the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. The commission was a statewide commission convened in 1997, did a report in 2001, got a lot of international attention. And after that, there's been a lot more discussion, dialogue about these events, and a lot of scholarly study and so forth.
So for African Americans, it had a lot to do with it's the historical trauma that we're still experiencing. I mean, even though they kind of kept it quiet, it was muffled. Some of them feared, some of them wanted better for their children, but that trauma still exists. You know, it's kind of like what you mentioned on the title of the book.
And let's not pretend as though it exists only in Tulsa, because when we talk about what happened in Tulsa in 1921, the national context is really important. So 1921 comes on the heels of 1919. Summer and fall of 1919, James Weldon Johnson, NAACP called it Red Summer. Red's a reference to the blood flowing in the streets from all this civil unrest. These were mostly attacks on black communities, but they were called race riots. Simultaneously, we have the prevalence of lynching. Lynching is a form of domestic terrorism, often targeting African Americans. But the point wasn't simply to punish an individual or a group of individuals. The point was to send a message to the entire black population about their relative place in society. It's a tool of white supremacy.
Yes.
So we need to be able to utter those words, white supremacy, and see the through line to events like the January 6th event at our Capitol.
You're right. You're right. So in your introduction, you write, diversity, equity, and inclusion rest on the fundamental proposition that our shared humanity trumps all that might otherwise separate and divide us. I love that writing. Our community is defined by how we treat the least among us. Do you find that Tulsa is more or less divided now from subsequent generations after the race riot? I know you've talked about how the climate was, nationally, but has Tulsa seen any healing after in different generations, you think?
Well, there have been a lot of initiatives. Some of us come kind of in fits and starts, but part of the good news is we have a huge, generous philanthropic community that really has gotten on board with diversity, equity, and inclusion, is working really hard to provide supports that are targeted to close those gaps that we talked about. So that's a really positive development. But the wound has been festering for decades and decades and decades, and it's unrealistic to expect that it's going to close in a decade. I mean, it's going to take a long time to repair the damage that's done and was unaddressed for such a long time.
Right. I like the poem you had written, Healing Histories. So he's got poetry in the book too, guys, just to let you know that. And the open line reads, unfortunate history, unpardonable sin, wretched deeds, where to begin? The closing states, healing our history, knowing the trust binds us together, elder and youth. So how do you see healing as the needed, I call it a balm for the historical trauma that Tulsa grapples with?
Yeah, I guess I would pose the question, what is the alternative to healing? I think we have really no choice but to figure out ways to heal. And healing is a process, very much like we talk about racial reconciliation. These things are journeys rather than endpoints. And I think it's helpful to think of it that way. Otherwise, we get frustrated because these are not, we're conditioned for instantaneous gratification. What most of us want is to be able to check the box on this, that, or the other, and then move on to the next thing.
Yes.
It doesn't work that way, certainly in matters of race and reconciliation, it doesn't work that way. These are challenges that we continually face, and we have successes, but we'll have setbacks. And if we get frustrated and we feel like our efforts have been thwarted and we just give up, then we'll have done all that for naught. I mean, we're not going to make progress. So it's important that we understand that this work is continuous, sometimes cyclical. Let me give you an example.
Okay.
So right after the election in 2008 of Barack Obama as president of the United States, I was reading all these articles and talking to people who were talking about, oh, it's wonderful. We're in a post-race America and it's great. And yeah, right. And that's what I thought at the time. Yeah, right. But certainly now, part of the prior administration was a reaction to President Obama's tenure in office. So we have to understand that this work is broad and deep, and there are successive generations coming along, and we have to educate them, and that we have to understand that just because it's quiet out there doesn't mean that the demons are gone, the problems have been solved.
Right.
There's always work to be done.
Right. I'm glad you mentioned that about education, because the African American Resource Center at Tulsa City County Library, they have some empathy kits that you can check out and use in your home. But I like your book too, because there are so many activities that are included in your book. And I just kind of want you to just talk about some of those, because I want the people who haven't had a chance to read the book to know that there are guides and questions in the back of the book. And tell me why you included that. I mean, you even gave some points for each chapter, you know, and I thought, my goodness, this is so that you can really get it. And then I think one of the guides is for 8th through 12th grade. So
Yeah,
let's talk a bit why you included that and how we can use this.
So I think I would use the word access. So, I mean, I like for these books to be accessible to a variety of different kinds of audiences. We know that there are different learning styles. We know that some parents like to read with their children. If you want to read this book with a child, say a young teenager,
Yes.
then there are some activities in the back of the book, like even a sample curriculum guide and other kinds of activities that you can make this kind of a fun activity learning about this history and bring it down to a level that it's possible for you to share with a younger person this information.
And I think that education would be a strong weapon. And I think this is a good tool for using that. You also have something for a personal leadership action plan. And I think we have to, you may think that we have to take a personal responsibility for ourselves about what are we going to do.
Yeah, and so the reason that personal leadership activity plan is in there is exactly that. So one of the things that's important is for us to understand that we have a role to play in the trajectory of this history. We may not have been here in 1921 or 1941 or even 1961, but we're here now.
Right.
And we are part of the community because the community isn't defined by any individual's lifespan. The community goes on.
Right.
So we inherit both the benefits and the burdens of our forebears.
Yes.
And so now it's up to us to resolve the unresolved.
Yes.
And so we need to be thinking, doing introspection. How is it that we can be an active, affirmative agent in change in this community?
Very well said. Very well said. I understand you brought some letters or something you wanted to share with us.
Well, when we talk about this history, I think we make a fundamental mistake when we focus our attention exclusively on the massacre. The massacre in 1921 is an event. The event happened in the context of a community, and it happened to people, by people, between people, among people in the community. So what's important is the character of the people who inhabited this community, what they did prior to the massacre, what they did during the massacre, and what they did after the massacre. So one of the things I shared it in the first Black Wall Street, and I share it when I do speaking engagement, just because it gives people an example of what I mean when I talk about the human spirit, and that the basic story is the story of the human spirit. I share 2 letters. The letters were exchanged between dear friends, a fellow named Curtis, who lived in Detroit, and Curtis was writing to his friend Oliver, who lived in Tulsa. Curtis had just become aware of the massacre in Tulsa. That's why he was writing Oliver. And he says, "Dear Oliver, I am by our local newspaper fully advised of the whole terrible tragedy there. Now that they have destroyed your homes, wrecked your schools, reduced your business places to ashes, and killed your people, I am sure that you will rapidly give up the town and move north. Enclosed, please find a draft for $40 to purchase your ticket to Detroit. We'll be expecting you, Curtis." And the reply, "Dear Curtis, how kind of you to volunteer your sympathetic assistance. It's just like you to be helpful to others in times of stress like these. True it is, we are facing a terrible situation. It is equally true that they have destroyed our homes, they have wrecked our schools, they have reduced our churches to ashes, and they have murdered our people, Curtis. But they have not touched our spirit. And while I speak only for myself, let it be said that I came here and built my fortune with that spirit. I shall reconstruct it here with that spirit, and I expect to live on and die here with it." Oliver.
Love that.
The story is the story of the Olivers of the world. It really is a story of the indomitable human spirit that was endemic in the Greenwood community on Black Wall Street here in Tulsa in 1921 and well beyond.
And you talk a lot about that spirit in this book. And I was just amazed to see that. Well, I think we're at the point where we have some Q&A questions that have come to us. And so I'll ask the questions and we'll move to the first one here. It says, I'm interested in knowing about places flying over Greenwood and planes flying over Greenwood and bombing.
So I mentioned that commission, the riot commission, was called the Oklahoma Commission to Study the Tulsa Race Riot of 1921. It's a state commission that was convened in 1997, issued a final report, excellent report, 2001. The report's available on the website for the Oklahoma Historical Society. One of the things that they looked into, because it was a fact-finding commission, was whether planes were used during the massacre. The answer to that is clear. Planes were used. The official version is that there were planes who flew over the Greenwood community doing reconnaissance missions. In other words, looking to see what was going on the ground. There were eyewitnesses, credible eyewitnesses like B.C. Franklin and others, who said that the planes dropped incendiary devices, or what you might call bombs. They could have been kerosene or turpentine, that caused the buildings to burn more quickly and the fires to spread more rapidly. The planes were privately owned planes, according to the commission, but absolutely planes were used during the massacre. And there's credible evidence, significant credible evidence, I would say, that the planes dropped bombs on the community.
Thank you for that. Our next question is, what do we know about the National Guard response, how it came about, who authorized it, and who asked for it?
So if I recall correctly, the governor got involved. The governor was asked to send in the National Guard. So a unit from the National Guard was sent in from Oklahoma City. The governor also declared martial law. The National Guard did quell the violence early afternoon on June 1st. But unfortunately, the National Guard was a participant in rounding up people and putting them in these internment centers and so forth. Keep in mind that this is 1921. The National Guard consists of a group of white men. They're coming into a community where Black folks are involved in what they were calling a riot. So that's part of the dynamic, is the psychology operating in the minds of the people who are coming to stop it.
Yes, that's good. So next question is, how can the truth of racial hatred be examined with a culture that intentionally leaves and, I think, dysfunctions in a systemic denial of their own actions? To look at the obvious and say, I don't know how we got here, is to practice insanity for the safety of the examiners. It sounds like a comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a well-placed comment. We have people in leadership positions who live in denial. If you say after January 6th, for example, that white supremacy is not a thing and is not a threat to our democracy, then you're living in a world of denial. And if you live in that world of denial, then we can't fix what needs to be fixed.
That's very true. Thank you. Let's see what our next question is. Mr. Johnson, do you feel that tourism is part of the picture of healing and reconciliation with Greenwood? If so, what form should it take?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yes, to the extent that tourism is a part of the learning process. For me, it's not the commercial aspect of it so much as the opportunity for people to come to a place like Greenwood Rising and learn about the history. While they're here, I hope that they would patronize places like Silhouette and like Liquid Lounge, some of the Black businesses that are on Greenwood. I mean, surely that's helpful to them as well.
Think about some of our listeners, they may not know about Greenwood Rising. What would be some of the features of Greenwood Rising that might speak towards?
So Greenwood Rising is just a history center. So we've intentionally not use the word museum, but it's a history center. It's like a museum. Loosely, it is a museum. The reason we declined to use the word museum is because a lot of museums are focused on artifacts, old items that they display. This is a narrative facility. So we're focused on telling the Greenwood story through exhibits.
Okay.
So it's a place that will offer learning opportunities, and again, offer opportunities for patrons to leverage what they've learned and apply it to current situations that need to be addressed around race, challenges that we have.
Right.
It's also a place in which at the end of the experience, we have a reconciliation space where people can actually leave commitment statements and pledges and so forth, in addition to dialoguing around reconciliation.
Good, good. Mr. Johnson, do you feel that tourism, that's the same one. Let's go to the next one. What are some actions I can take to make a positive change on the racial relations in my city, my neighborhood, even my home?
Yeah, there are a lot of things that you can do, surprisingly, to make a real difference and understand your own agency or your own capacity to be a difference maker. The first thing I would suggest is, I'll use that word, the big word, introspection, self-awareness. Figure out what your own implicit and explicit biases are and how they operate in your life. There are a lot of tools online that you can use to get in touch with those biases. And ideally, you have a circle of friends in which someone will be willing to sort of offer you constructive, positive feedback in terms of your biases. You can also be an ally of organizations that focus their mission around fighting bias, bigotry, and racism. In the United States generally, one of them is the YMCA, or the YWCA, the YMCA too, but the YWCA has a very specific mission that's an anti-racist mission. And in Tulsa, Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice, which also has an office in Oklahoma City, fighting bias, bigotry, and racism is part of the mission. You are no doubt represented by somebody on a school board. If we really want an inclusive curriculum, if we really want a people's history of the United States taught in our history courses, then your school board member has some influence over that. So you can influence your school board member. You're also represented by people at the local, state, and federal levels. Those people have influence in terms of closing those disparities that I mentioned exist. Disparities in education and healthcare and criminal justice, and on and on and on. And there's a simple concept that you can start soon, maybe this weekend. Invite somebody from a different racial group to your home for dinner, to your intimate space. Well, in COVID, it's a little bit difficult to do that, but you mask up, have it outside. Invite somebody over. The point is not simply to have the person over, but it's to have the person in your intimate space and to have a meaningful conversation. Talk about race, talk about criminal justice system, talk about the educational system. This is an opportunity to build a relationship across these racial or cultural lines. And if we ever want to build trust on a community-wide scale, we have to start atomically by building relationships one to one to one. So those are some simple things that you can do if you really want to start the ball moving on becoming a better, more inclusive person, and a person that's in touch with the concept of reconciliation.
Very good answer. I'd love to know more about Oliver, the letter you've written. Can you tell us about what you have learned about Oliver and your research?
Unfortunately, I don't know much about Oliver beyond the letter, because the letter to me, when I first read it's amazingly gripping to me, that letter. Every time I read it, I feel something. And I've read it, I can't tell you, I probably read it 100 or more times, but I feel something every time I read it. I would love to know something more about Oliver. The letters were published in a Greenwood Chamber of Commerce publication, probably in the early 1930s is when they were published in the book.
something else that survived that helps us have some authenticity about what actually happened. The next question, do you see the anti-Black violence as connected to the settler colonialism impacting, the area with Oklahoma having only become a state in 1907? And if so, how so?
Well, certainly we have a history of anti-Blackness in Oklahoma as exhibited by the first law passed by the newly minted Oklahoma legislature in 1907, which was Jim Crow laws and segregated railroad facilities. After that, a number of segregation edicts followed. One of the most horrific lynchings in America that's depicted in lynching photography. There's a great book of lynching photography, which everybody should see. It's shocking in a way that we all need to be shocked. One of the most notorious lynchings happened in Oklahoma in 1911 in Okemah, the lynching of Laura Nelson and her teenage son. Woody Guthrie, as a child, actually was taken to this lynching to witness it by his father. So the anti-Blackness in Oklahoma occurred almost immediately after in the run-up to statehood. And it's particularly ironic because for a long time, Oklahoma was thought of as an escape from the oppression of the Deep South in places like Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia and such prior to statehood. Oklahoma was being promoted, even by Black boosters, as a veritable promised land. Where people could come, they could stake out a claim to land, have economic opportunity, live among Black folks, not face the oppression that people faced elsewhere. And then Oklahoma begins to mirror or mimic Southern oppression when she becomes a state, in part because some of the people who came to Oklahoma and settled Oklahoma were people who had come from those other states.
Yeah, we had Black legislators too, prior to. The next question is, I have read elsewhere that when the National Guard arrived from OKC, many stopped for breakfast before coming to the aid of the citizens of Greenwood, prolonging their response time. Can you corroborate this?
So I can't definitively corroborate that. There are stories that they were not as timely and didn't proceed with the urgency that people wanted them to proceed. But they ultimately got here. They did ultimately quell the violence. So
yeah, did their job. So how far north did the massacre span? Pine, Apache 36th Street, I guess it means for today.
Well, the Greenwood District, the north boundary of the Greenwood District is historically considered to be Pine. So Pine would be that area.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk about the use of the green cards that was used after the massacre?
Yeah, so there's probably a green card on file here at the library. The green cards are the identification cards that were given to people who were interned in these internment centers. Right. They had your name on them, and generally the green card had to be countersigned by a white person. In other words, a white person had to vouch for you to get you out of these encampments once you had those cards.
Dr. Johnson, since you rightly mentioned that the effects of 1921 will not be resolved completely in 10 years, what do you hope to be the signs of measurable improvements in racial equality and unity at that 10-year mark? My personal hope is that Tulsa can lead the nation in this healing.
It would be great if we can be a model for healing historical racial trauma that happened, again, all throughout the nation. We know, for example, I mentioned 1919 Red Summer. So the Red Summer riots are in places that you might be surprised. New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Omaha, Nebraska, Elaine, Arkansas, Longview, Texas, and I could go on and on and on. So if we could be a model for those communities and other communities that have suffered maybe a different kind of historical racial trauma, like a lynching, a prominent lynching. Duluth, Minnesota comes to mind. Memphis, Tennessee comes to mind. That would be a wonderful thing. I think we have more objective measures that we can look to 10 years down the road because we're in the process of this equality indicators work. And the equality indicators are measured periodically They're on the City of Tulsa's website, and they are gaps based on race in criminal justice, education, healthcare, and on and on and on.
Right.
And we can see whether we've made progress on these measures.
Right. Yes.
So that's if you want an objective set of criteria that we can measure over time, I think the work on the equality indicators is great for that reason.
I think that's a good point there too. And then if they are well published, then we can all see how well we're doing and where we're not doing. I had another question that came to me earlier. This one says, Theater North sponsored a huge Greenwood Arts Jubilee Festival on Black Wall Street in 1982. Thousands upon thousands came. And me personally, as a native Tulsan, it wowed me that, I heard so many people speaking about Greenwood and what Greenwood was in its heyday. I think they weren't talking about the 1920s. I think they were talking more about the 30s, 40s, and the 50s. And it had been depressed and neglected, so to have that festival down there it was really significant. So I was just wondering what other significant occurrences, I guess I want to say post Tulsa Race Massacre, that may have shown some sort of huge sentiment, how people loved and embraced Greenwood. I guess obviously they came back, they brought it back too. That was one thing.
Yeah, I think people often misunderstand the trajectory of the Greenwood district. So it was virtually obliterated in the 1921 massacre, but as an entrepreneurial economic community, it came back bigger and better than ever, and peaking in the early to mid 1940s. Right. That's really the peak of the Greenwood business district.
Right.
And then it was very successful for a couple of decades and began to decline for a number of reasons, I think, which are pretty interesting. Well, perhaps the most ironic reason the Greenwood community declined the second time was integration. We think of integration as a positive value. Things are opening up. We can go places we couldn't go. We can spend money places we couldn't spend it.
Mm-hmm.
True. But if you understand that the Greenwood community as a business community was a community of necessity, it existed as a business community only because Black folks couldn't engage with the dominant culture economy.
Right.
So that's called what I call an economic detour, meaning they go down to the mainstream economy downtown, but they're turned away, go back to their own community, create their own sort of insular economy, and it's successful. Dollars are circulating within the context of this community called Greenwood, called Black Wall Street. When integration comes along and is in full sway, then Black folks have the option of buying things outside the community. There's a lot more things available to them at lower price points. So the economically prudent thing to do might be to shop outside. Well, ultimately, over time, that undermines the financial foundation of the community.
Yeah.
Right. And even we think about Black professionals like Black doctors, once things are integrated and you can see the white specialists and doctors over on that side of town, and people over time begin to do that, it really undermines what was keeping the Greenwood community as a vibrant community. And if you add to that things like urban renewal or urban removal, as Jim Goodwin or other people would say, then you're talking about displacing Black people from the heart of the Greenwood community. We look at I-244 that barrels right through the center of the Greenwood community. So those things came fairly simultaneously, and that was just a bridge too far, really, for the Greenwood community to be able to survive and thrive into the future.
Right. Yeah. I think that's a good answer. I could not help but wonder, and it's several examples of this, all these apologies that happened in 1990, and from like the mayor's apology that we know about that was public, establishing even the State Race Riot Commission was done so many years later. I didn't expect it to happen in the 30s or the 40s or the 50s, but you would think during the Civil Rights Movement that maybe, they would have established a commission, but it came so late. And even the Tulsa Regional Chamber providing minutes as recently as 2019, I just find that this is just amazing that all of this happened so more recently, actually, I should say. Is there any perspective on why maybe that in Tulsa happened that way, or is that more indicative? Or
Yeah, I think it's just been a gradual process. I think it's become, as more information is out there and more people are discussing these events, it becomes incrementally easier for people to come forward with things that they have. People are burdened by, holding things close to the vest. People are burdened by what their organization may have done in the past. And, it's a relief to them to be able to share or to be able to contribute something to the healing. People want the community to be healed. And they think, what is it that I can do to add to this movement forward toward healing?
Just like the letter from Mrs. Hammond.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think we got one more up there.
Okay, that's good. Let's see. Are there any businesses that revived after the massacre and that still exist today?
If you hadn't add that and that still exists today, we could have,
Well.
yes. So revived after the massacre, after being destroyed. The best example is the Williams Dreamland Theater. Of course, it doesn't exist today. I don't know of any business that existed in 1921 in the Greenwood district that still exists today. I can't name one. I don't know if you.
Well, I was thinking about the barbershop, that was there, but I don't think so.
So with the one exception, it's not a business per se. Booker T. Washington High School existed in 1921. It was not destroyed. It was used as a hospital, and it still exists today. So that would be the kind of it. And then I guess if you count, it's not a business either, but Vernon AME Church, it existed. And it's
might as well say Mount Zion too.
Yeah, Vernon actually has structural components that were there in 1921 are still there, like the basement part. Mount Zion, the dirt floor basement is all that they had left. So none of those are businesses per se, but there's institutions or entities that were there.
Right. I think that's very good. So I want to, as we get closer to closing out our wonderful discussion that we've had here today, I'm kind of a graphic kind of person too. So this image on the front cover of the book, the unknown man looking at the devastation of Greenwood and the 1921 Black Wall Street Memorial, I just thought, to me, with the title, this was so appropriate. How did you come about this?
Yes, it's just kind of luck. I mean, we were talking about what to do for the cover, and the publisher had some images that I'd sent, and ended up merging two images. One image is the man looking at the memorial is obviously a relatively modern image.
Yeah.
It's probably 10 or 15 years old. And then the destruction is a massacre image. But they fit, in my humble estimation, they fit perfectly together. I mean, it just really works well, I think.
It brought a smile to my face. I thought, boy, this is so on task. Looks like we've got another question here. How many times did a dollar turn over before leaving Greenwood when it was at its height? I want to say heyday. Did many of the residents who were chased out end up returning? And did many descendants of those who either died or were chased out return?
Yeah, the question about the number of times a dollar turned over, I don't ever use that any number, because I think it's impossible to verify that, and I don't like talking about stuff that I can't prove.
Right.
So it's no doubt the case that a dollar turned over a number of times in the community, because it was a segregated community and there were limited places for the dollar to go.
Right, and look at the property damage numbers too. That was
Right.
2 million in 1921.
Right.
So.
The other part of the question has to do with people being chased out or returning. So what we do know is that most African Americans in the Greenwood community did not leave, which is a strong message about resilience. It's the embrace of the notion that we shall not be moved. You do all these things if you want to, but we're really not going anywhere. And you can take one of us or two of us or three of us or 300 of us, but we're not going anywhere.
Right.
So it's a real message, important message that comes at an important time. And that's why the NAACP in New York City, for example, sent money here to help rebuild the community. That's why Booker T. Washington's Black Chamber of Commerce held their annual meeting here in 1925.
Yeah.
It's a signal.
Right, yeah. And I just, I've always hoped that we would have had that, maybe like at the 100th centennial year, that we would have had another African-American businessman conference here just to give recognition to what happened back in I think that was in 1919 or 1920, but it was prior to the race riot, just a couple of years before. Okay, do we have any more questions? No more open-ended questions. Well, I do want to say a few words about this wonderful discussion that I've had here with Hannibal, and I feel like I could just go on and talk. I want to thank all of you all for joining and listening to author Hannibal B. Johnson speak about his newest book, Black Wall Street 100, An American City Grapples with Its Historical Racial Trauma. The book is endorsed by the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission and the 400 Years of African American History Commission. I want to thank Tulsa City County Library CEO, Kimberly Johnson, the Tulsa City County Library Commission, and the Tulsa Library Trust. Black Wall Street 100 with author Hannibal B. Johnson has been a community read event. Copies of the book are available for checkout at any of your Tulsa City County Library locations. You can visit our website at tulsalibrary.org, or you can purchase from our partner, Fulton Street Books and Coffee. Please visit the library's website or call the library at 918-549-7323 to find out more about Tulsa City County Library events and resources as TCCL remembers commemorating the Tulsa Race Massacre with education, equity, and healing. There'll be a link on the last slide that you'll see, and this link also gives you the link where you can find out about all of those activities that were mentioned by our CEO that the library will be celebrating. Thank you, Mr. Johnson.
Absolutely.
Wonderful interview. I certainly enjoyed it.